I'm Karen Maeda Allman. I'm a longtime supporter of Densho, and I've been involved in bookselling for over 30 years. I grew up reading to and alongside my Japanese mother and American father. Books like the one Maggie Tokuda-Hall has written didn't exist back then. I've watched with joy and awe as talented Japanese American writers have come forward and published books which help readers young and old learn more about the incarceration and its aftermath. Author Maggie Tokuda-Hall has an MFA in creative writing from the University of San Francisco. Her books include the 2017 Parents' Choice Gold Medal winning picture book, Also an Octopus, illustrated by Benji Davies, her young adult novel, The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, an NPR, Kirkus School Library Journal, and Book Page Best Book of 2020, and its sequel, The Siren, the Song, and the Spy, published just last week. But she's with us this evening to speak about her picture book, Love in the Library, illustrated by Yas Imamura and published by Candlewick Press. Love in the Library was named a Best Picture Book of 2022 by Book Page, School Library Journal, Booklist, and Publishers Weekly. Maggie, could you tell us a little bit about the book and why you wanted to tell this particular story?
Sure. Firstly, thank you to Densho so much for asking me to be here today. I'm really honored. And Love in the Library is the true story of my grandparents, Tama and George, who met in Minidoka during World War II. Tama was the camp librarian in Minidoka, and every day George would go in and check out huge stacks of books he had zero intention of reading so that he could go flirt with her. And it's my favorite family story. It's one I've known for my whole life. And I had never considered making it into a children's book or in any way trying to claim any sort of ownership of it until 2017 when President Trump took office, and it became clear when his very first act in office was to try to pass the Muslim ban or travel ban. And it was clear to me that he was going to be using his time to just put forward the most cruel and white supremacist agenda that he possibly could. And so I did all the things I knew I needed to do, like I called my Congress people and I wrote my angry postcards and I did all the protest things. But I also really tried to audit what I might have to offer in this situation that was unique, that might be something no one else had. And I realized I had this beautiful story in my own family about the incredible cruelty of these kinds of policies, but also about the incredible resilience of the people who they target. And so that's how Love in the Library originally came about.
I understand that you bring this beautiful book into schools. Can you tell us how Densho has been a helpful resource for you in helping children connect to this history?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I wrote Love in the Library, I didn't do a lot of research because it was a story that I have heard since before I can remember. It's a story I know like the back of my hand. But I knew when it became a real book, I was going to go into schools and I needed to become an expert in the incarceration and be able to speak to it really fluently and to be able to answer questions that, you know, a lot of the things that are kind of given in this book pose a lot of questions for small children. And so Densho's been an incredible resource for me. So when I was preparing the school presentation that I give, and I was looking through photos to try to find pictures of Minidoka and of my grandparents even, and I was able to use Densho to do that. And beyond that, when I give the presentations, I always like to make sure that the kids and the teachers know that this conversation doesn't need to stop with this book, that their curiosity doesn't need to stop with this book, and that there are a lot of really wonderful resources available to them, like other books, but also like Densho, which is available online, and that is such an incredible resource. And so that's something I mention at every school visit I do.
It's great to hear about how valuable Densho resources have been. That really fits into their core mission and growing interest in creating more educational resources for younger audiences. And all these resources are free. This book was very well received, your book, and attracted a wide readership and many positive reviews. And it was nominated for many honors. And this is one of the reasons why Scholastic, which has direct relationships with over 90% of U.S. schools, public and private, approached your publisher about producing a new Scholastic edition of your book. So what happened next?
Yeah, so one day I got an email that was really exciting, which was that Scholastic had reached out to Candlewick, who published this book in 2022, and they wanted to make a Scholastic edition of it to be part of a particular featured display that they were doing of AAPI stories. But there was one caveat, which was if they were going to offer me this licensing deal, I needed to make some edits to my book. And I opened up the PDF of what their proposed edits were, and it was only in my author's note. And they had excised an entire paragraph that talks about how what had happened to my grandparents was not a unique experience, that in fact, this history of mass incarceration and white supremacist policies is one that is a defining characteristic of American history. And beyond that, they had also deleted the word racism both times that it appeared in the author's note. And it was when I was looking at those red lines, when I realized they wouldn't even let me say the word racism in talking about what had happened during the incarceration, that I knew there was absolutely no compromise to be had. There was no way to tell this story without calling it what it is, which was state-sanctioned racism. And so I was really furious because it was an incredible opportunity. Scholastic has such reach, and they go directly into classrooms. And I wrote this book to be used in classrooms. I imagined it as being part of the curriculum, the kind of thing that could open up conversations and avenues of study into this period of time. And so, I was really torn for a moment because I wanted so badly to accept this incredible deal, but the price was so high, and beyond being a high price, it was such an offensive and specific edit. And it was clear from the letter that they had sent me that they were doing it because they were concerned about the rising culture of book bans, and they were worried that the language I had used in my author's note was a little too incendiary and might turn some of their market off, and so they were worried about any kind of limit to their sales that might happen because of the kind of language I had used. And so I decided to say no. But beyond that, I decided to say no publicly and to make the letter that I sent back to them public and open, because I suspected that I was not the first marginalized author that they had asked to make this kind of compromise. And I really hoped that it might just create an environment where other authors of color, other authors with marginalized identities, would feel a little bit empowered to mention to their editors or to their agents that they were given edits that they weren't comfortable with. Because the edit that they asked for was trying to hold this kind of impossible center of, we want to honor these sort of diverse stories, these stories that highlight people of color and their experiences in this country, at the same time as appeasing the very same people who are uninterested in hearing those stories, and beyond that, banning these kinds of stories wholesale. It wasn't going to matter that I had used a small amount of language that might rub one person the wrong way. It was already, the source was already going to be the problem. So I was sort of shocked, and I wanted to make a stand that this was not something that I accepted, and beyond that, it was not something that I felt other authors of color needed to accept. And so it sounds sort of trite now. It's like I wrote it up on my blog, I tweeted about it. But that was the venue that I figured was most appropriate, because I kind of figured it was an intra-community discussion within children's literature about how we talk about history. But it became a lot larger than that really quickly, and a lot of educators became involved really quickly. And it became clear that people suspected that something like this was going on, and a lot of people really rejected that entire premise. And I was so pleased to not stand alone in that moment, because I realized I was standing on the shoulders of so many educators and activists who've already been doing this kind of work for so long to ensure that when we tell the story of our past, when we tell the story of our nation, especially when we tell it to children, we tell it in its fullness and in honesty. And so I said no. I still have said no to them. So I am really pleased that Candlewick has been so supportive throughout this process, but it is not a Scholastic licensed book.
Wow, that is so chilling that book bans are encouraging publishers to ask their writers to censor books. And it's mind-boggling. And I think that, here we're in banned book week and Books Week, and there are ever more book bans happening. And so I think it's really important and timely that we're talking about it today. Can you tell us, you told us a little bit about educators' responses. Could you tell us about some of the other responses that you've received?
Yeah. Before I do, I just want to be really clear that Love in the Library hasn't been banned. It was a case where the publisher was trying to preemptively censor, and that these bans disproportionately affect Black people, and LGBTQ plus stories, and particularly where those identities intersect. And I think one of the reasons that there was so much response to my particular story is that I am not a Black person and I am a cisgender woman, and there were a lot of things about my package that made it more appealing as a story to tell, rather than the kinds of authors who really do face these bans constantly and whose identities are being attacked much more violently and with much more concerted effort. There was a large backlash because of the amount of attention that it got. And so Scholastic did recant, and they said, we would love to license your book without any of the proposed edits. And I had a meeting with them and their CEO, who's Peter Warwick, and the president of their education division, which is the division that had made me the offer. And in that meeting, I really wanted to go in with the goal of restorative justice. I wasn't interested in getting a better deal for myself. I wasn't interested in punishing them or making them ashamed. I really was just concerned with making sure that they did better by my community, which is the community of marginalized authors at large in the United States, because I understood that I was being given this really unique opportunity by dint of luck and just happening to be the person who said this one thing this one time. This is something that a lot of authors are facing. And my goals for that meeting were to get an honest recounting of what had happened and to ask them what they intended to do to make sure that this never happened to another marginalized author again. But most importantly, from my perspective, was what did they plan to do to combat book bans? Scholastic is a billion-dollar company. They have incredible resources. And book bans often target their books. The book Melissa by Alex Gino is one of the most banned books in the country because it was one of the first middle grade novels to have a transgender protagonist. That's a Scholastic book. They have a vested interest in fighting this. But in the course of that meeting, it became really clear that they were unable to answer what had happened. They didn't let the editor who had made the offer in the room, which I actually do understand. They didn't know what kind of personality I have and if maybe I was going to be the kind of person who would yell or be abusive. I could see why they would do that to protect their own employee. But I was surprised that nobody who was in the meeting was able to answer it. The best answer they could give me was that someone had a bad day at work, which was not an answer I accepted because it was clearly one that was made from a place of expertise, where they said, well, we like this book, but we're worried this message is going to interfere with its saleability. That's not a oopsies. That's an evaluation that comes from somebody who understands their industry and also understands the priorities of the company that they work for. I asked them what they were going to do to make sure that this never happened again. And they said they were going to hire outside auditors to kind of come into the company and see what had happened and see how they could make sure it never happened again, which on its face sounds like a really satisfying answer. The idea of going outside of the company is, of course, a good idea. But it is also the same answer that they gave about 14 years earlier when their book club division got busted by Lauren Miracle for making the same kind of offer. They said they would love to carry her middle grade novel if she took the gay uncles out of it. She said no. She said no publicly. There was a big backlash. It's a familiar story, you might notice. It sounds very similar. And that was the answer they gave at that time, was we're going to hire outside auditors and we're going to make sure that this never happens again. Obviously, that wasn't sufficient, and so I did not accept that aspect of their answer. And lastly, when I asked them, what are you doing to combat book bans? Because they were all like, oh yeah, we agree, book bans bad. Book bans are very bad. And I was like, okay, well, what are you doing? What do you provide in this? And they said, well, we provide annotations. And I asked, what does that mean? And it basically, to them, is the good press that a book gets. Like if Kirkus gives it a good review or NPR says it's a good book. And for context, that's the kind of information that is available for free on the author's website because we're all monsters who collect every good review that's ever been said about us. And also on the Amazon page. This is not the resource of $1 billion company. This is free information. And so none of their answers were acceptable because none of them made it clear how they were going to protect other authors of marginalized backgrounds from this kind of treatment. And so the goal of restorative justice was shot, and I had to say no.
So I have to say that when I was growing up, and for many years into my bookselling career, there weren't many books like the one that you've written, and there weren't books like Melissa. But now that's changed. Books like Love in the Library can really help open up conversations, encouraging children and adults to talk with each other, to ask questions, and to find out more. So as we close, a lot of what you've talked about tonight has had to do with restorative justice. What would restorative justice look like for you in this context?
Within the context of the history of Japanese incarceration, to
Yes.
me, it is not the reparations that were paid during the 80s, which I understand were really hard fought for by activists, and I do not mean to belittle their incredible work. But while those reparations were being paid, the Reagan administration had their backs turned to an entire demographic of people who were dying in the hundreds of thousands because they refused to put any government funding to understand what was going wrong, because it was a disease that primarily targeted gay men, and Reagan did not care about gay men. So the injustice persisted. To me, what it looks like in this situation is the cessation of mass incarceration. It's making sure that when we talk about what our families went through, the grave injustice of having our homes taken away and our lives stopped and being put into prison, that doesn't stay like as a little time capsule, as something that is unique in American history. This is such a broad history. Minidoka itself is on unceded Shoshone land. This forced removal is not something that is specific to us. Mass incarceration is not something that is specific to us. And so it is not accepting symbolic apologies anymore. I think we are past the point where that is acceptable.
Thank you, Maggie. Your work and your insights, and also the work of organizations like Densho give me hope for the future. We have so much to learn from Maggie, her generation, and those to come. Maggie's work also shows respect for those who came before her, including her grandmother Tama, her uncle Kip, and her mother, Wendy Tokuda. They were all fierce advocates for justice for those in our community, Japanese Americans, and all others suffering from racism and other forms of oppression. We remember and we act.